Telling stories is a vital aspect of preserving history and creating culture. Oral tradition, or the act of telling stories from generation to generation, has preserved beautiful traditions that we enjoy today. I believe that every person has a story, and that listening to these stories validates an individual. Throughout my travels in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, I have had the pleasure of meeting some incredible people and hearing some amazing stories. A majority of the individuals I have met are those fleeing their home and country due to war, conflict, or extreme poverty. My interactions have shaped the way I see refugees and the refugee crisis, as I have been moved from feeling overwhelmed at the enormity of this issue towards being hopeful for the individuals involved. My interaction started in North Africa, and this was the beginning of my change in thinking. For 1 month, my friends and I started a skill training and development center for Sudanese refugees living in North Africa. We taught sessions in sewing, handicrafts, and carpentry using our own talents and abilities. I taught a hairdressing and cosmetology course to a group of 5 women from the ages of 17 to their mid-40s. My translator was this beautiful young Sudanese woman, and she helped me communicate the practical ideas which would help these women despite their living situations in the project-like area of the capital city. And I remember one night we ventured to teach manicuring nails, and as I was doing a tutorial on one of my friends, I explained how in America it's very common to give a hand massage as a part of the procedure. As I worked massaging the lotion into my friend's hands, I suddenly noticed a change in the room as each of the ladies started to shift in their seats. And I suddenly became very fearful that I had done something wrong or crossed some kind of cultural boundary. So I turned to my translator and I asked her, "Is this okay?" And her response was, "Yes, it's fine. It's just that we never treat ourselves like this." At the end of the lesson, I noticed that we still had some time left over. So I asked my 5 ladies if they would like my friend and I to massage their hands. That way they could get a feel for it if they were to do this on a client. And they responded with yes, so we brought out the lotion. As we worked massaging the lotion into their dry hands, the whole atmosphere of the room changed. Each one of these women were laughing and smiling and uttering these loud exclamations of joy. When one woman said something out loud in her native tongue, I turned to my translator to ask her what it was that she had said. Her response was, "We have never felt like God's beauty before." And I cried on the way home that night because I realized that while we were hoping to restore financial stability or self-sufficiency, there was a greater restoration that was at work. Because that night, each one of those women felt beautiful, and they felt worth. In short, they felt like people again. For the rest of the month, I got to know my 5 ladies on a more personal level. And as I got to know them and to hear their stories, I realized the greater depth of that night of hand massaging. Each one of these women have lost so much. They've all left home and country, and for many that included family members, parents, husbands, even children. And yet, despite this, one of the things that they craved so deeply was that desire and that need to feel valued, and that was satisfied that evening. To me, they are not just a group of refugees from Sudan. They are individuals who I know by name. I know their stories, and I know their loss. Refugees, and especially those in transition, live a life of waiting for a job or a connection or the green light to move and to find more permanent housing. Oftentimes, these individuals experience extreme boredom and alienation. There are very few opportunities for them to feel valued as an individual with thoughts and ideas. This prison of waiting is most common for those fleeing the war-torn nation of Syria. With conflict coming from every angle, families chose to flee in the hopes that their children would never have to witness the horrors they had seen. Mothers left with their sons who were given the death sentence of a draft. Fathers left their hard-earned occupations and lifestyles as their towns were infiltrated. And we've all seen the pictures. We all know the statistics. But last year, I had the opportunity to meet the people. In November of 2015, I spent 2 weeks in an area of northern Jordan working with a local organization that was helping provide much-needed supplies to the individuals and families who were living there. And in order to respect cultural norms, we made sure that there was at least one man and one woman per group that was going on a visit. And one night, a group was gathering together to visit an elderly woman who was living in a tent distributed by the UN. I volunteered to be the female member of this group, and the job was not difficult. Go to the tent, take off your shoes, say a few greetings in Arabic, sit down, and wait. When we had arrived, I wanted to help navigate these heavy gas tanks that would be powering heaters and blankets, which would help her through the long winters ahead. And as I attempted to help navigate these heavy gas tanks, the ground was just littered with rubble and cement, and cultural rules, and if I'm honest, my own lack of strength prohibited me from helping. So, feeling useless, I approached the tent. And she was sitting with her legs crossed, and this look of both apprehension and excitement on her face. I stumbled through the door of the tent, careful not to carry in any dust or dirt from the ground below. When I went to sit down next to her on this poor excuse for a mattress, there was something in me that just knew to sit close. I had desperately longed to communicate more than my memorized words and phrases in Arabic, but when those ran out, I just simply sat, gazing into her wrinkled face. She placed her hand on my knee and she spoke. A lot. And though I could barely understand the words that she was saying, in a moment I understood what it was that she was communicating. It was her story, and in that moment, she needed it to be heard. Now, have you ever had one of those conversations where afterwards you feel physically full? It's almost the same feeling you get after you've had a good laugh with your best friend. Well, I love those conversations because they remind me of how simple joy can be. The joy of simply knowing someone and for one moment seeing them for who they are, a person with a story. This was the first time I've had one of those conversations where I have felt so full without actually understanding the words that were communicated. But through hand gestures and facial expressions and then my own broken understanding of Arabic, I was able to understand what it was that she was communicating, and that was her story. I had later found out that this woman had been reaching out to various aid organizations and nonprofits seeking help, and yet we were the first ones to meet her in her space. And seizing that opportunity, she made her story heard, despite language barriers and even cultural ones. Now, every story is complex. There are many different characters, challenges, and climaxes. Each one has a backstory, and that needs to be taken into account. Whenever we are working with people, and I think we would all agree, we do that on a daily basis, we need to realize that their backstory affects the way they see the world. This became evident to me as I was working for a nonprofit based here in the Bay Area. This nonprofit serves immigrants and refugees from Afghanistan, mostly living in Fremont, California. Though a majority of these individuals are those seeking help after the transition from war-torn life in Afghanistan to life here in the US, others are those who have lived here for years and have just valued the relationships that they've built through the nonprofit, so they continue to visit regularly. One of these women, and let's call her Mary, I've known to have a very dry sense of humor and to be very kind. But one day when she came in, she looked so downtrodden. It was as if this heavy cloud were just resting over her. And she sat in the room with my coworker and I, and she explained to my coworker in Farsi what had been on her mind. As she did, she pulled out an envelope, and inside were beautiful photographs. They represented my friend living in Afghanistan in what I believe to be the late 60s, early 70s. She was standing in front of her house and she was beaming. She was standing next to her husband, whose smile was just hidden behind his facial hair. They were both beautiful. They could have been movie stars. Mary looked down at these photographs and she simply sighed. Life is. Then she trailed off. I realized that when I think of refugees and their arrival to a beautiful country such as ours, I had wrongly assumed that this was the end of their struggle. And while it is true that we need to celebrate refugees' arrival and their safety, we cannot do this forgetting what they have left behind. Because Mary clings to these photographs because they represent a life that once was. In them, she sees all of her hopes, her dreams, and her desires for what her life would have looked like. And I've come to realize that I cannot empathize with the refugee crisis because it is too big. With too many factors and too many opinions, it would be overwhelming. I can, however, empathize with a refugee. And when I narrow the scope from crisis to individual, I am filled with hope. In North Africa, I thought the greatest assistance we could provide was a restoration of finances. Development projects do present a unique opportunity to not only help a group of refugees towards stability, but also to help an individual feel valued. The elderly woman in Jordan had physical needs as well as emotional ones. Listening to someone's story can help them as they are processing through trauma. While working with refugees here in America, I had wrongly assumed that this was the end of their struggle. And so we always need to remember the things that refugees have left behind. I am continuously learning that in order to have a positive impact on this crisis, I can no longer categorize it as a whole. Because it is the individuals and their stories that make this a crisis. This is a disaster, and it is because it is made up of individuals with a broken past, a story waiting for climax. And so I can no longer say, refugees need blank, or we need to blank, because each individual is working their way through their own story. And so in order to have compassion, in order to actually empathize with them, I must no longer say them, but I must see the individual. In order to restore the value essential to each individual, I must first see them as that, a valued individual with a story to tell. Thank you.